Okay, so now we need to build out what is going to be essentially our set. We have our prop, we have our character, now we need our set. We're going to start this out by creating a texture for the ground, and we're going to create something called a tileable texture. That's something that repeats infinitely. So I'm just going to start a new scene here. We're going to go to our create, polygon primitives, and plane. We're just going to create a plane for this. You can scale it up if you want. But that is pretty much going to be our ground for this. And we'll edit this in various ways, but we're going to use this to check our texture. Now, tileable textures are used a lot. We'll be exploring them in later segments for texturing objects, but when it comes to ground surfaces, tileable textures are very common. And the idea behind them is they repeat infinitely so that you can scale them to cover the whole world. So in short, you could use a single texture for everything. So we're going to hop over to Photoshop for this, and I'm going to create a new document. I'm just going to come up here to File, New. We'll set our width and height to be about 1024 by 1024. You don't have to go crazy with this. And then we need to find some sort of an image to use for our texture. So let's go ahead and source one from the internet. I'm going to navigate to Unsplash, which is that stock photo website I've been using. Once again, the useful thing about these stock photo websites like this is these claim to be royalty-free, which means we can utilize these for commercial purposes, meaning to make money. Now, you could probably go onto Google, find tons of images, but we're going to utilize this to find something that we can use. Now, since I want this to kind of be in sand, I can look for sand here and take a moment to look for some textures to use. Now, what are we going to be looking for when we are looking for textures? You want to find something that has minimal light information, meaning that there's not a clear light direction. So this image here would be an example of where this would not be good, because this side is clearly shaded, whereas this side's clearly lit. So we have this idea of the light coming from this direction very clearly. So that's something we're going to want to avoid. Other things you want to avoid are going to be blurring. So you can see the background here, this glacier is blurred. There's sort of a depth of field effect going on here. This wouldn't be an ideal one. Other things are photos that have been edited. You can see the contrast here is very dramatic between the darks and the lights. There's a good chance this has already had digital editing, so that's going to be things we want to avoid. Other things, just low quality. This one here looks like it could be okay. There's a hint of light directionality, but it's a little bit ambiguous. That could be just height information. So I might go ahead and pull that off on a new tab. This one as well, we have that highlight, but you can see we don't really have a strong shadow. So it's mostly just shading information. That could be useful. And there's various ways we can edit these. It also depends on if we want to have that level of waviness, which I'm not sure we do. I think something a little bit more sporadic and random would be nice. So something like this, I think this will work out perfectly. There's not strong shadows. The directionality is there, but it's a little bit limited, and there's some things we can clean up. So let's go ahead and click the download for free here, and we'll go ahead and download this to use. And we can go ahead and bring this into Photoshop. So I'll just go ahead and float that. We can drag and drop this into our document here, and there's a good chance this will be larger than our document, so let's go ahead and Control-Z, and instead drag this into a new document. Before we start using this, it can be a good idea to do some cleanup on it. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. We'll just come down here and create our layer to have a fresh layer to begin with. And we're going to utilize a tool called the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp is this one right here. It looks like a stamp. Pretty easy to find. There are other ones under this. The clone stamp's the most common one. You can see there's a pandered stamp and a clone stamp. And there's going to be a couple things we want to check. First off, make sure you're on your new layer. And up at the top here in the settings, make sure the sample setup is to all layers. I don't believe this is the default. I'm pretty sure I've changed it. I use this tool a lot. So you'll notice it's current, current and below, and all. I generally like to work at all. Current means the one you're actively on. Current and below means the one you're on and everything below it. And then all layers is all layers in the scene, even the ones above it. I just like to have it set to that so I can work back and forth pretty easily. So once we have that set, we'll be able to sample a region by holding down the Alt key, and you can click to sample an area, and what it will do, if you can see it, I'll make my brush bigger. The hotkeys are the same, so you can use the bracket key to make the brush bigger, or smaller, you might be able to see that there moving on the screen. It'll make you so you can paint that region of the image somewhere else. Now, usually it's best to not go too crazy with your locality here. So coming all the way over here and then to here might be a bit of a stretch, but I could come to here, for example, and I could just paint this out using the local colors. Same with this one over here. I could just click Alt somewhere in this area and then paint in that area. Down here, I can hold down Alt and then paint that out. And you'll see what's happening if I turn off my base layer is we've just covered those up with swatches of the same image. So now we've gotten rid of those imperfections. So from here, I'm actually just going to shift click these, right click and merge layers, and we're going to float this and drag it into our 1024 image. Now you notice, like I mentioned, it is a lot bigger than our 1024 image. So I'm going to Control minus to zoom out, Control T to transform. And then what I can do is I can scale this down till it's about the right size. And when it comes to tileable textures, you basically want to have a 3 meter by 3 meter sampling of your texture. So that's going to come into like a 10-foot square. So plenty of size there. But basically, we just want to sample that the best we can. And what I'm going to do here is just snap this to where it's filling in the space fairly good. And we have an area that is somewhat repetitive, but not too repetitive. So I think this section here might look kind of nice. I do notice these are pretty repetitive there with the lines. We may be able to work those out in the process we're going to use for tiling. Hard to say. So what can I do here to help that out? Well, let's just leave it as is and we'll save. Let's go and do a file, save scene as. Let's place this into our set and we'll just go ahead and create a new subfolder here called tiles. And we'll go ahead and name this one sand underscore color and save. Now, coming into our Maya scene, we can assign a new material. We can do a standard surface shader like we have before. We'll just go ahead and make this our sand underscore shader or underscore material. That's a better name. And then what we're going to do is hook this up to our color. So we can come to our base, our color input, file, and then add in our sets, tiles, and sand color and hit open. Hit the 6 key so we can see it, and there is our beautiful texture. If we want to see it with lighting, we can come to import our preview lights, and we can get a better look at this with the lights turned on. So it'll look something like that. Okay, so we've assigned our material, and you can see we have a lot of work to do. One of the things we need to do is we need to make this repeat. There's a couple of different ways you can make this repeat, and one of the ways is actually through the nodes inside of Hypershade. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. If you come up here to Hypershade, you can access the nodes to the shader. And inside of the node for the sand material, if we go ahead and click on this and then use the input-output connections here, we can map this into our work area. And one of the things you will notice in your node setup here is going to be something called a place 2D texture node. And that should be connected into your color. So you'll see these are linked together. The place 2D texture is telling Maya how to place it. And one of the things we can do in here is we can make it repeat. So you'll see down here we have the option of repeat UV, and it's currently 1 and 1. This is going to be represented on the U and V axes, so the horizontal and vertical axes. So if I were to, let's say, repeat UV 20 times here, you'll see that it will stretch in that direction 20 times. But if I were to do it 20 times here, it would make this repeat across the surface 20 times. Now, I don't want to repeat 20 times, but we might go ahead and do something like 10 for now. But you can see how we can make that repeat infinitely. And now this entire surface is being UV'd or textured by the single texture over and over and over again. The idea behind making this a tileable texture is to make it so when it repeats, we don't see this repetition. And that's our goal here. So let's hop over into Photoshop and see how we can accomplish this. The first step is to crop the scene so that we don't have any extra trimming. You'll see when I click on this layer, we actually have a lot of extra on the outside, and that's going to be problematic because the tools we're going to use are going to offset this based on the image size, not the document size. So we can use the crop tool over here, to crop this layer to be a perfect square. By default, when you click the crop tool, it should crop to the document size, and you can just double click to apply it. Now you'll see when I select this layer, it doesn't extend beyond the bounds of the document. We can double click this and name this base, and then we can duplicate this up by alt dragging to create a new one. And we can use this to do our offset. You're going to find the offset under filter. Inside of filter, we can come down to other and we can select offset. And what this is going to do is it's going to offset one corner of the image to the other as if it's tiling behind the scenes. So we can use that offset there to repeat. You'll notice it's not doing anything here because we're offsetting by the document size, which is 1024. What we want to do is offset by half the document size, which would be 512 and 512. And you'll see now what's happening is this is repeating in the corners. So we can hit OK, and we can do a file save. Now, this doesn't look great, but you'll see that something happens in Maya here, where instead of these looking like they're tiling repeatedly, if I come into the attributes and double click to update the texture, you'll see now the corners are tiling. We can actually preview this inside of Photoshop now as well if you come up here to View and utilize Pattern Preview. Pattern Preview will let you preview this. It's going to let you know some tools don't work with it, but you can see how this is tiling inside of Photoshop as well. Now, I'm going to turn that off because we don't want to utilize that at the moment. We want to come in here and make some edits. So one of the really easy edits you can do to this is you can actually just erase away the lines. Let's start with that. I'm going to come to my eraser tool, which is located right here, or you can hit the E key. Up at the top, I'm going to make sure it's using a soft round. And what I can then do is make my brush a little bit smaller, click on the middle line, hold Shift and drag to create a straight line, and then do the same on the sides. So what I'm doing is just kind of erasing away some of these areas. Now, to blend it a little bit more, I might come in here and just brush around some of these areas. This brown area here kind of stands out, so I might get rid of some of that. And same with up here. And I'm just using the eraser to erase that away. And it looks like simultaneously I'm kind of bringing some of it back, so I might need to be careful there. But if I go ahead and save this now, and we take a look at this repeated, we should start to see that it's not quite as apparent it's being repeated. Some of the areas are very obvious though, these dark brown areas, so we're probably going to want to work those out, but you can see how the repetition no longer has those lines in it. Yes, we can tell it's repeated based on the patterns, but at least it doesn't have the lines. So we can start to work on this to make it repeat a little bit less. We could maybe identify some areas we like, some areas that work here. Between these, we could even backpedal here and use the first one. But an area that stands out to me that's working really well is this center line here. It might be nice if it was just that for the whole thing. So what can we do next? I'm going to create another layer, and this time I'm going to resort back to my clone stamp over here. I'm going to Alt to sample this mid-wave I like here. Okay, I don't know, it's not giving me a preview here. It doesn't like the background here. I'm going to double click that background and delete it and just see if that fixes it, and it does. And what we can do now is we can come in and we can start to stamp this in and just fill in these spaces with this color a little bit more. And you don't necessarily have to go 100% with this. We can play around with this. You'll see it's getting a little bit of blurriness from sampling the same thing over and over. So you might want to sample some different areas. But you could actually lower the opacity on this too, to kind of remove some of the color there and blend it back to this source color. So you can see here's 100, here's 0. If we kind of work this in between, we can get to something that is blending that darker color in and removing some of the detail, while maybe giving us a better tile. I'm not 100% sold on this. I think the fuzziness from the blurring here might be diluting this. So I'll delete these, just create a fresh layer and maybe come in with my clone stamp on the base here and just sample this area across on the base to remove some of these orange areas here. That still is giving me a little bit of that oranginess, but I think this is giving me a better result. So I'll just kind of sample this to get a nice generic sort of sand. Okay, so I think that's starting to get there. We're also losing some of the directionality, which is actually something I like. So let's just do some final touches here. Let's duplicate this, merge it, do our filter other offset to get that repeated. Our eraser lines down the middle of these to get rid of the seams. Make sure you're using the eraser and not the brush. Oops. Maybe do some extra work with the eraser to clean up in here. Save and see how it looks. Okay, so we're getting something like that. Now, these areas are looking a little bit flat on the repeated side, and that hill's looking a little bit too angular. So I can hop back over here and remove some of those. So I could either use the erase to just get rid of that, or I could use something like the clone stamp. So we could create another layer with the clone stamp. And as long as we don't strike the edges, we actually are fine to not have to repeat this again. So I can get rid of that area. Some of these areas here that have this sort of flatness to them, I'm just going to add in a little bit more texture from one of the textured areas that has a nice strong look to it. And those are areas that probably just kind of got blurred out from the editing tools we're using. I'll be completely honest, sand's probably not the first best experiment with tiling, but since it's what we're using, I figured it would work out okay. I stand corrected. It's a bit more challenging. But you can take your time with it here, just kind of clone stamping out areas. You don't want it to repeat too much, but depending on what other things we incorporate into our scene, we can probably get away with not having to worry about it being too obvious. And you'll see now that's looking a little bit better. We still have some of these flat areas I'm not the biggest fan of. We could try bringing over the original even, which is kind of strange, and just kind of blending it with opacity to fill in some of those areas and give this a little bit more directionality and detail. So you can see how that kind of adds in some flatness too, which is actually kind of nice because we don't really want those rigidness. So a lot of weird techniques we can use here to kind of blend these images until we have something that works as a texture. And I'm actually liking this setup here because it's getting rid of some of those bends and creases for us, surprisingly. I might even hit Control T and try flipping vertical or horizontal to see what it does. I like that. So that's giving us the light in the other direction. And as a consequence, it kind of blends it down to where we don't have any directionality here. So that's a bit ambiguous. I don't know if I'll like that, but the next step would be to duplicate all these. I'm just clicking the top, shift clicking to the bottom, alt dragging, right click, merging layers. Then I'll duplicate again, filter other offset just to make sure there's no seams, which there will be since this is a new one. And just like we did before, you can erase those down the middle. Clean up any areas you don't want, and save. And I think we might have a decent looking tile after all that. Okay, kind of still obvious lines there, so we might need to work some of those out still. And it's a pretty organic process. You just kind of keep repeating until you find what works, if I'm going to be honest. So it's more about the techniques than anything else. But that should give us an okay look. And I think that's a good start for something sandy. If we were to look at that on the ground, I think that could pass. Okay, so that's going to be the rough process of creating a tileable texture. So let's go ahead and simple that down to a series of steps. The first thing you need to do is you need to get some sort of an image. This can be sourced from the internet. It can be a photo you take personally. It can be something you actually paint. It doesn't really matter, but you need to get some sort of a source image of what you want to tile. The next thing to do is going to be to crop it to a square. In particular, a square that is some sort of resolution. So in this example, we use 1024 by 1024, but that could be higher, it could be lower, depending on your needs. Once you have that done, you're going to duplicate it. So you have one on top, and then you're going to use a filter offset, and you're going to do that at 50% of the resolution. So in this case, it was 512 by 512. Then following that, you're going to clean up the seams. This can be done doing erasing like we did. You can also use things like the clone stamp. And once you have this set, it's basically just a repeat until done. So repeat until you have something that looks nice. And that's a quick way to make a tileable texture out of anything. Now, I do want to mention you can find tileable textures to use online that are already made for you, but very often that is not an option because they're usually non-commercial or something you have to pay for. The other thing is you can't always guarantee it's going to be exactly what you need. So knowing how to make it yourself is valuable. So with that said, as a challenge, what I want you to do is I want you to try and make your own tileable texture for the ground. Whatever sort of ground you're going to have, I'm using sand, but you could use something like dirt or grass, whatever you want to do. Go ahead and try and make your own tileable texture. And as a bonus challenge, what I want you to try and do is create a normal map for it and a roughness map. We don't really need a metalness for this because there is no metal, but if yours has metal, feel free to try and add that. So go ahead and give that a shot. Then we'll go ahead and resume and see how we can do that together. All right, so coming back, let's go ahead and save this out once again, just in case. It looks like I already have. And let's export this for a normal map. So we can actually use our Smart Normal website I showed you guys. We could do an export. So we'll go to export, quick export as PNG. We can kick this out of here into our source images set, and in our tiles, I'll actually just make this our sand underscore tile because we don't really need to change the name of that. We could use that later, and we'll save. And in addition to that, we can hop over to Smart Normal here. So I'll just go to Smart Normal, access our link, and then come over here to load, and we can convert this. So we'll go to source images, set, tiles, and sand tile and hit open. And you'll see there it is. So just like that, we get a nice indication of our sand tile. We can play around with the bias here to make it higher or lower. Sand is actually pretty subtle, so we don't need to go crazy with it. I think the default might have been fine, but I might just take it to where it's not too intense. You'll see this is too intense. Anytime you start to see yellow in a normal map, that usually means you've gone too far. So I'm just going to take it just beyond that. So maybe somewhere between 58, 60. I think 60 is fine. I think that was the default. We could probably bump it up a little higher, but I don't want it to stand out too much here. So we'll keep it at around 60 and we can save this out. So we can do a save image as, we can save this into our source images. We could go to set tiles and we could just make this our sand normal or sand tile underscore normal, whatever we want to use as our naming convention here. And we can plug this in Maya. So we have an idea here from the lighting, how this looks. We can come into our standard surface shader, navigate down to the geometry section, go into the bump map input here, and we can input our normal just like we did with our robot. File. Before we bump over to the file, you can click this to tangent, so you can do this in a linear process, tangent space normal. From there, you can click your over arrow if you don't want to go into hypershade, the little black over arrow. We can plug in our normal map here. So if we come to sets, tiles, sand normals, and hit open. And then remember, we need to switch this down here from sRGB to raw. So we're going to do that by coming in here to our utilities and go to raw. And now you'll see that we just get that nice roughness to the surface. So it's not perfectly flat. We have sort of a bumpiness there. Now, the next one is very challenging when it comes to sand, which is the specular aspect. If you take a look at sand, it does have a soft sort of specular to it, which is not very easy to recreate, in all honesty. So what are some of the ways we could do that? Well, first off is to understand what creates a soft specular like that is going to be roughness. So sand is actually fairly rough. Which makes sense, right? If you think of things like sandpaper, it's a rough surface we use to scratch up other surfaces. But there are often specks of sand that sparkle, which is what we're seeing here. And that's one of the things that can be a bit challenging to recreate if we want to have that sort of effect. So what would this effect sort of be? Well, that's where you have rough surfaces, but you also pair it with non-rough surfaces. So I don't have a magic way to do this. I haven't done a whole lot of sand, if I'm going to be honest, but we could start with an image like this. We could just start by merging down our layers, and you might want to save this separately. So save as. Instead of sand color, we can make this our sand roughness. And we're going to start by desaturating this. So we're going to use some hotkeys here. A hotkey that I like to use to desaturate is Control U. This is going to pull up a hue, saturation, and value adjustment, and we can take the saturation to 0 and hit OK. And what's interesting here is this by itself might be enough to give us the roughness we're looking for. We have some black areas, we have some nice soft rough areas, and we have a mid value in between. So let's just save and see what that does for us. So coming back into Maya, we can come into here, and in the specular roughness, we're going to expand this out. Make sure your specular weight is at 1 and your color is white, and then we can come to the roughness dial to input this. We'll link in a file, and remember this file is not actually working initially. We need to come here and we need to select the file that we just added in, and we need to check the alpha is luminance to get that to hook up correctly. So once we have that set, that should give us a more accurate read on this. And now you'll see that we're getting a bit of breakup to the surface, but that looks too slimy, looks too wet. So we're going to need to adjust that. At a tangent angle, it looks okay here, but with the sun coming from the top there, not the roughness we're looking for. We can go ahead and adjust this using an adjustment layer like a levels to push and pull the contrast. So let's go ahead and explore adjustment layers in here. We can come over here to the Adjustments tab to access the adjustment layers. And inside the Adjustments tab, we're going to access an adjustment layer here called Levels, which is this shape here. This icon is also known as a histogram, and it's used heavily in digital imaging editing softwares. It lets us see the gamma of the image and adjust the gamma. We used this previously using Control L as a hotkey. That is a destructive edit, but using an adjustment layer like this is non-destructive, meaning that it won't affect our scene. Now from here, we could use the black point and the white point to change the range, which will give us more contrast, but we don't necessarily want more contrast. We want less contrast with more brightness. So with that, we could use the center one here, which is the gamma, and that's going to shift the white point. For roughness, we want to drag this to where the gamma brightens the image. What we might want to do now is consider clamping our range, which is bringing these dials in. This will get us closer to white faster and closer to black faster and get some of those specks in between. So now what I'm getting is just some areas where we should have really high reflectivity, middle reflectivity, and a lot of roughness. So I'm just dragging those around here to see that result. So we'll save. And then we can come into our shader here, and hopefully now we'll have something closer to what we're looking for. Now this is getting a little bit suspicious because it is not actually updating. So I'm going to just re-plug in the file. And it looks like I never actually plugged in the file here. I could have sworn we did, but I guess I forgot to because I was too busy showing you how to apply alpha to luminance. So we can backpedal here, but you can see the effect it's giving us now is that roughness with a few of these areas just having that nice little spike that we're looking for. So let's tone this back down a bit. I might even be able to drag it back to these points. Got to make sure you're plugging in those maps. Unfortunately, when teaching, my brain's going a bit faster than my workflow. And that looks a little bit better there. So I think that might do the trick. I don't know if we're getting the hard specs like I was wanting though. So I might need to play around with that to see if I can't get some of the darks back in here. But I do like the range we're getting a little bit better than when we had it completely clamped. So we can try saving that again there. And we just have a couple of those areas that the light really hits on. And I think that looks nice. You can see those there. And if I were to move the light across the surface, tangent to the surface, we would see that reflectivity in some of those areas. So I think that'll look nice once the light's shining on there. All right. So that'll incorporate our roughness. It'll incorporate our specular. I could also consider making it a little bit less rough overall. I'm using Alt-Tab to move back and forth between these, by the way. Really useful Windows hotkey. It lets you jump between documents. So I do want to get a little bit of that shine on there. So it's not completely matte because sand does have that softness, and that'll give us an okay look. So I think that will give us a decent set for our shaders, and it will enable us to have what we're looking for. Because we have that non-destructive, we can always come back and edit it later, which is nice in case we do want to change that up. Maybe just a little bit more this way, a little bit rougher. Well, yeah. We won't know till we have our set sort of shaped. But I think that's a good start. Okay, so that will give me my sand shader that we're going to use. We'll just keep it simple, like what we have there, and call that good. So that'll give us our color, our normal, and our roughness. And you can see how we derive those all through photo images to create our nice looking sand here that we're going to use for our scene. And just remember that it's in the hypershade here. We can come in and we can tile this. So if you're working on your scene and you decide, well, maybe this has been tiled a bit too much, we can always bring this back down to 1 by 1, which is just the default here. This is what it looks like normally, so we can kind of see the specular hits there. Or if you want more, you could go crazy and we could go something like 200 by 200, and you'll see now we have a completely different look to this. That's probably too much, but hey, somewhere in between, 20 by 20, 10 by 10, you know, whatever you want to do, you can change. You can see how those specular hits are coming in though. We're getting those little spots of highlight, which is pretty cool. One thing you might notice though is those aren't showing up in the right spots. When tiling multiple textures, we do have to tie these all together using the UV coordinates. What's interesting though is you could potentially map all these to the same input. It's a bit of a pain to do, but for now, let's just repeat these together. This one's currently 5 by 5. We could come into the normal, make that 5 by 5. And we could come into the roughness and make this 5 by 5. Now, is there another way to do tiling? Yes, there actually is. We'll explore that later on. It requires us to discuss something we haven't quite got to yet, but we'll probably take a look at in a moment here. But that's how we can get that set. Now, just for the sake of future endeavors, I would suggest setting the repeat to 1 by 1, which is the default. So if we do look at the other one, you can set that up and have access to it. But that's going to be one of the ways that you can tile these. Okay. Also, be sure to save your scene. You can save it out into the set. You could create a new subfolder here called texturing. And you could just save this out as sand texture setup. Okay, so make sure you get that saved. So with that, if you have not done so already as your final challenge, now that we've looked at how to create the normal map and how to create the roughness map, what I want you to do is create the normal map and the roughness map for your sand tile. Okay, so go ahead and get that set and we can start shaping this into some sort of environment when we are ready.